and also in the morning, and also in live and on Zoom, and they're in the social hall or the big synagogue because of the COVID restrictions.
Oh, so they can have the space.
Right. Correct. Okay, so one minute, I'm going to bring something up. Okay, good. So, Bobby's here. Good. Okay. So here's the story, and we also have it running on Facebook. So here's the story. Uh, what I wanted tonight, what I wanted to talk about, is indeed the fundamental question, not of history, but of the right of the Jewish people, um, to the land of Israel, which literally means the question as to why they have the right to hold on, to the land in spite of other people's claims. And I'm talking exclusively from the point of view of Judaism, from the point of view of uh, of the Torah. Uh, in other words, there may be other paths to understanding why we may hold on to the land of Israel. There may be practical reasons, but I want to talk about the fundamental, shall we say, moral, ethical, and spiritual justification to our present ownership of part of the land of Israel. As you know, the present day state of Israel, um, uh, is on part of the biblical land of Israel, not the whole thing. That's first of all. Um, just one second. That's so. I want to begin with the fact that various claims have been made as to why the Jewish people, other than the fact that possession is 9/10 of the law, but as to why the Jewish people should be allowed to hold on to the land, uh, and uh, and what the status of any other parts of the land that might come into our hands may be. Then we'll talk about the question under what circumstances might it be permissible to uh, relinquish portions of the land of Israel, if at all. And we will address that. In a moment. So let me begin with the claims that are often made. Now, the first is a claim mostly made by enemies of the Jews, but certainly it's something that a lot of more secularized Jews make. And that claim is that after what happened in the Holocaust, it's quite clear that we can rely on no one, that the Jewish people need their own land. They need a land with an army to protect them, etc., etc. And that, of course, is a somewhat reasonable argument, though, I wouldn't say that we haven't been, that we pretty much been left alone in this country or in Canada for that matter. But on the other hand, when the chips were down, that this country and Canada weren't exactly allowing Jews in. So it's obviously not so simple. But I want to say that claim our enemies say that just because you had a Holocaust, why should you come to the land of Israel and displace those already there, which isn't really what happened. But the point is the claim that we were persecuted and therefore need a land and therefore have a right to the land of Israel, that would be like, all the Rwandan refugees, popping themselves down in Wisconsin and claiming that they have a right to Wisconsin because they underwent a genocide. I mean, the Holocaust may have been the worst, but it's by no means the only genocide in the last 150 years. Unfortunately, it seems to have become a bit of a habit of humanity to engage in genocides of each other. So, for that matter, the Armenians or the Darfuris might come and demand a state of the United States. So the argument from the Holocaust, which again is mostly claimed on our behalf by our enemies, by those in particular Arabs and their supporters and fellow travelers who don't want us to be in the land of Israel, they often use that claim. So we will establish that is not a legitimate claim we should be making. Maybe it illustrates the urgency of having a place for the Jews to call their own, but it's not a reason, and it's certainly not a right or a justification for establishing ourselves for taking the land of Israel. Now,
are you going to bed?
Now,
Yeah.
so that is the. So those are some of the. That's the first issue. The second claim is the claim from history, and for those people who don't like the biblical claim, which I will soon discuss, the claim from history sounds like a good one. The Jewish people lived in the land of Israel for several thousand years. Any aboriginal inhabitants who preceded them are no longer around. We've never relinquished our claim to the land of Israel. We've mentioned it in our prayers every day for a long time. Though, frankly, the secular Zionists were unlikely to pray, but they like referencing the prayers. I mean, that's the fact. Yossel, Joe, you're here there?
Yeah.
You'll appreciate this. Someone once complained to Ben Gurion. He was talking to one of the Haredi MKs who complained they don't say Hallel Yom Ha'atzmaut. He says Ben Gurion also doesn't say Hallel Yom Ha'atzmaut. But of course, the key issue over here is that if you don't want to make a religious claim, you make a claim from history. The problem is the fact that you lived somewhere 2,000 years ago doesn't necessarily give you the right to come take it back by force. Where we're sitting right now, wherever you're sitting, used to belong to the Native Americans. We've given them bits and pieces and casinos, but we've not handed the whole United States back to them. Nor will we hand the whole Britain back to the Irish, or the descendants of the original Celts who lived there. nor will we hand all of Europe back to the Basques, who are the sole descendants of the original inhabitants of Europe before 4000 BCE. Ain't happening. And therefore, that claim that we once lived there and we have a historical connection to the land is not enough, because with that claim, we would have to upend the borders of every single country on this planet. So that's also not good enough.
Rabbi, but all of these you mentioned never came back and asked to come back and get the whole United States or Britain or anybody else.
Well, if you'll read Native American writing, they make that claim. They just know they're not going to get it. They still live here. They want it back. They're just not getting it.
They did not occupy all of the United States either. There were
They
not
did.
that many of them.
Well, there's a book you should read. It's called 1491. And there were probably 50 million people in North America before the diseases of the white people wiped them out. There's a complex of cities on the Mississippi that probably held over 1 million people. So don't kid yourself. It's not a reason.
Okay, Rabbi, so let's take our case. So the luck that we had is, with the exception of a small city like Yafo, and Jerusalem was very small with not too many Arabs and a few Jews that used to come. The land was pretty empty. So when we started settling,
that's the claim that Peters makes in the book From Time Immemorial, which, even though all the lefties don't like it, it's backed up by actual British documents, Turkish and British documents. There's no question that the vast majority of Arabs living in Israel, in the land of Israel today, the so-called Palestinians, came because the Jews began to make it a viable place, and the British had reasons to want to occupy it. And once the Jews did a lot to make Israel livable, the British actively encouraged emigration, in particular from Egypt, which was overcrowded, to the land of Israel. Yasser Arafat, for example, his family was all Egyptian.
All the Palestinians today all came from different countries. Other than
Listen,
Palestine.
those are all legitimate claims.
No, but I didn't finish what I wanted to say, really. Let's assume that that Eretz Israel was heavily settled by 1948 or the beginning of the 20th century, and there were all Arabs. What would have happened to us? Would we accept it? Would we have even been offered it? Probably not.
Right, that's the history. I'm talking about the legitimacy of our claim. And in that legitimacy, tonight I want to talk about two things. The first is the legitimacy of the claim to come. So, for example, most of Israel was historically owned by the government. Even today, almost all the agricultural land is leased. It's owned by the government. Most of Area C, the less inhabited areas in the so-called West Bank and Yehuda and Shomron, are also owned by the government. And this goes all the way back to the original Arab empires and even the Roman Empire. The monarchy, the empire, owned most of the land and rented it out. So once we came into possession of that land, it belongs to whoever the government is. But that's a legal question. I want to get to the core moral question, the core ethical question. In other words, by what right do you hold on to the land of Israel? Granted, Arabs who did not fight with us were not displaced, and that's why the Galilee is still very Arab. But those who fought with us and lost and ran away, we absolutely took their land. Why? Because we're not allowed, it's very clear from the Torah that non-Jews will own land in the land of Israel. It's also clear that once we come into possession of land in Israel, we're not allowed to give it back. But there's a larger point. The larger point is that the Torah may allow non-Jews to live and own land in Israel, and it does. But the fact is that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people in a way that history cannot change. In other words, whether we were absent for thousands of years or we were not, whether other nations have come and lived there, it is all irrelevant. There is one claim that is legitimate and unanswerable to the land of Israel. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It's God's. He made it out of nothing. God sustains it at every moment. The world belongs to God. La Hashem haaretz u'meloha. To Hashem is the earth and all that fills it. Omer Rabbi Yitzchak. This is Rashi quoting the Midrash. Lo hoye tzarech lahaskil et Torah le'mechodesh es Elochem. The Torah was, we only really had to begin the Torah not from the whole story of creation, but from the law of Rosh Chodesh, which is the first commandment the Israelites were commanded. Now, for what reason did Hashem commence within the beginning? Because of the verse, the strength of his works he related to his people to give them the inheritance of the nations. For if the nations of the world should say to Israel, you are robbers, for you conquered by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, they will reply, the entire earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be he. He created it, this we learned from the story of creation. And he gave it to whom he deemed proper when he wished. He gave it to them, and when he wished, he took it away from them and gave it to us. And God told Avraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, and to Moshe in the Torah, in the borders of the land of Israel, that those borders I set by God in the Torah, they are a law in the Torah, like putting on tefillin or eating kosher or keeping Shabbat or not stealing or not murdering or not committing adultery. And this law of the Torah says that I have declared these to be the borders of the land of Israel, and I am giving this land to you forever and ever. And it's true that sometimes Hashem has punished us and sent us into exile, but that doesn't take away our claim. It merely means that circumstance of history forces us out by virtue of God's control of history. But the fundamental statement that I am giving you this land that God said to Avram, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov, Avraham through Yitzchak, not Ishmael at all, not Esav at all. And the statement in the Torah in Parshat Masai, which lays out the borders of Israel, that is God saying that I am the creator of the universe, I am the ultimate power, I am the arbiter of right and wrong, of moral and immoral, and I declare the land belongs to you. And any time, and that's the halacha, any time any portion land of Israel comes into our hands, even if you're a Jew with a little piece of land in the days of the Ottoman Empire, you must hold on to it, and you may not give it away to anyone else. You may not sell it to anyone else. It must remain in Jewish hands. This is the law. In other words, our claim to the land of Israel is that the Torah is true, and the whole world knows or ought to know that the Torah is true. And the Torah, God gave us the land. And if, like once happened, we had a big argument in Shul one morning during Shachris, well, the Arabs say different, the Christians say different. That's irrelevant. You know what? When the Saudis say no non-Muslim is allowed in Mecca, and this is our holy place, no one argues. This is what they believe. They're fanatics. That's what they believe. You can't take a person's belief away from them. So I want to tell you that this is what we believe. And this is the only true claim we have. All other claims are arguable. But the fact that God created the world, that God is the ultimate authority, and we know exactly what God said, people don't like it, tough luck. But we have to be sure ourselves that we have a route to it. There are too many Jews who unfortunately do not truly believe, even if they live in Israel, that they have a right to the land. The religious claim is the only legitimate claim, the only claim worth talking about. Now, I should point out that that a very large part of the world, even Muslims, deep down know of Hashem's covenant with Abraham, know that Hashem spoke to Moshe. As the Kuzari points out, their religions are based on ours. Deep down, they know this to be true. The only time, and this is the only claim that's worth making, and the problem, the only challenge we have is that there are many Jews who, including Jews from Israel, who are uncomfortable making this claim because they're uncomfortable with Judaism. So they need to work on themselves to be, and we have to work on them to be more comfortable with Judaism. And more than that, until COVID, we had the 8th grade of a charter school came every year to B'nai Torah and to talk to us. And every year, their teachers gave them different questions to ask. And every year they asked about what's going on in the land of Israel, the Arabs and the Jews. And I pointed out to them that to the Jewish people, just as the Torah is holy, and just as the Shabbat is holy, the land of Israel is holy. The very soil of the land of Israel is a chefza shel mitzvah. It's an object of a mitzvah. It is an object used for mitzvot. It is holy like a Torah scroll, if not more so. The Jew, the Torah, and the land, the body of a Jew, the Torah, and the land of Israel are all holy. In other words, the fact that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people and is an intrinsic part of Judaism, even when we've been forcibly removed from there, is as legitimate, as important as the Torah scroll itself. No right-minded non-Jew would suggest that we be forced to tear up our Torah scrolls. Nor would a Christian accept the demand that you give up belief in Jesus, or a Muslim give up demand that you give up belief in Muhammad or the Quran. What I try to explain to my fellow Jews and to non-Jews alike is that the land of Israel is the possession of the land of Israel, as intrinsic a part of Judaism as Muhammad or Jesus Lahavdil is to non-Jews, as the Buddha is to Buddhists, etc. And it's not negotiable because we believe and we know that God told us that this is so, and God gave us the land because we believe in the Torah. This is not a claim that one can refute. You can say, well, I believe in a different religion. Well, tough luck. We believe in ours, and we're going to hold on to what we believe in. And as long as we truly believe in our right to the land, we'll keep it. The problem is that whether Jews are embarrassed or diffident or don't truly believe in the absolute truth of the Torah, then we have a problem, because then they're not sure of their right. And let me say that you don't have to be, quote, religious to believe this. Deep down, I think the vast majority of Jews know full well that this is the case. But it's very important to understand that the fact that the land of Israel, the details of how you get it, how you don't get it, that's a different story. But the fact that any piece of the land of Israel that comes into Jewish hands belongs to the Jewish people, because the whole land of Israel was given to the Jewish people, which is commanded not to, before the coming of Mashiach, not to start wars to get it. We're commanded not to dispossess someone who is living with you peacefully and keeping the Noahide laws. In other words, a non-Jew who lives peacefully with you, who keeps all your laws, who accepts your rulership, who accepts that it belongs to the Jewish people, and who does not seek to undermine that in any way, such a non-Jew, you're not allowed to take his land away from him. You must allow him to live among you peacefully and happily and so on. But if he fights with you, if he or she attacks you, does other things to undermine makes it clear that they don't accept to follow the basic laws of decency and to accept the absolute Jewish right to the whole land of Israel, such a person has to be stopped. And if they have any plan whatsoever to attack you, you have to attack them first. That's number one. Step number two in our discussion is the idea of biza, of spoil. When you have a war with someone, it's very clear from the book of Bamidbar, very clear from all the books of Shoftim and Malachim, it's clear from Bamidbar with the story with Sichon and Og, that if someone attacks you under the law of the Torah, when you defeat them, their possessions are yours. You start a war, you lose it, you lose your land, and you lose your possessions, and be happy we didn't kill you and go away. That's the fact. War is with peoples. The fact is that, when we say, I like the individual people, I don't like the government. In the end, the government and the people are one. And in the end, wars are between peoples. And in the end, if you start a war and you lose it, there's a price to pay. And the Torah very clearly accepts the price as the land and your possessions. We're supposed to besiege a city on three sides to allow people to run away. We allow people to leave. Joshua told all the inhabitants of the land, if you don't want to, you can either keep the Noahide laws and accept our ownership, or you can fight us or you can leave. And some people left, it says in the Midrash. That's how it works. But my point is that first of all, until 1948, and Joe and Sydney know this. I know this because my grandmother had a little blue and white box, and her mother before, for the Jewish National Fund, they had a little pushka in their little house in Sheffield, where where they put in half pence, half a penny, whatever they could afford to buy land in the land of Israel, the Keren Kayemet Israel, the Jewish National Fund. First of all, until 1948, every single bit of land that a Jew lived on in Israel had been bought from the legitimate Arab or Turkish owner up to that point. Now you start telling me stories the peasants were dispossessed. That's true in the whole world. That's their societal problem. We bought it fair and square. Then the Arabs started a war of annihilation. They wanted to kill every one of the 600,000 Jews on the land. And they lost it. And when you lose a war, we don't have to keep hostile people on the land. It was a mistake not sending them away after the 6 Day War, but it's another story. And they left, and they should have left. And you start a war and you lose it, you lose everything. That's the price you pay. There's a price. If there's no price to pay for starting a war, you start a war again. Germany wasn't occupied very much. After World War I, they convinced themselves they were stabbed in the back. They started another war. After World War II, when they were bombed to smithereens, now the Germans are the most peaceful people in the world. They learned their lesson. Not to mention they have to give a quarter of Germany away to Poland. They learned their lesson. But this is in the Torah. This is God's teachings. This is what Hashem told us. You start a war, you lose it, you lose your stuff, and you lose your land. So after the 67 war, those who wanted to live in peace with us could have stayed. Those who didn't should have left. And certainly, once land of Israel comes into your possession, you have the absolute right to it. This is the first set of points. The first set of points is the right to the land, the fact that you cannot take it away from non-Jews by force unless they start a war with you, in which case the concept of biza, of spoil, of taking away the land and possessions of the enemies who wanted to kill you is entirely justified. And we allow them to run away. We don't kill them. We don't do genocide. We don't kill them. We allow them to run away. So that is the approach of the Torah to the situation. So just the opposite. There are perhaps pieces of the land of Israel that are presently in the hands of Arabs that shouldn't be. But at any rate, every bit of land, that, and for that matter, land that is government land, that historically was owned by the Romans and the Byzantines and the Mamluks and the Ottomans and the Jordanians, all that land, all that empty land, the so-called Area C in Yehuda and Shomron, that land has come into the possession of the present government and should be and belongs to the Jewish people and should be given over to unlimited settlement by the Jewish people. This is step one. Does anyone have any questions or anything they would like to say about step one?
I have a question.
Sure.
In the Torah itself, it tells us when they enter the land that we went forward and we started wars on the nations we found.
Right. So that is the 7 nations that lived in the land. That is the 7 nations who lived in the land of Israel at the time that there was a special commandment to wipe them out. That is a unique one-off thing that was never repeated in the Torah, and the rabbis are very clear is not meant to be repeated. Now, that until such time as Mashiach comes, we're commanded not to take it by force, but of course the basic obligation, which applies not just in the land of Israel, to defend yourself remains. So again, let's understand. So this is true, whichever position you take, with regards to religious Zionism and so on. But let's establish what happened. The Jews came to the land of Israel, bought a bunch of land at very high prices, land that no one else wanted. They cultivated it. They built a city on the sand dunes, Tel Aviv. They built up Jerusalem. They built farming communities. And then there was a partition in 1947. And then there was a war to exterminate every Jew in the little bits of Israel that the UN in their good graces assigned to us. And then miraculously, we won that war with God's help at great cost. One out of every 100 people in the land of Israel. 1% of the population died in that war. Horrible, horrible cost. And then we won, and all the people who tried to kill us, many of them left, and certainly all those nations as a whole, whether it be the Arab inhabitants of the land who fought with us in the Galil, many didn't, but those who fought with us, they lost, and they left as they should have, and their land became ours, because once you lose a war, you lose an unjust war, the winner on the just side has every right to the land and possessions. And in taking that land and possessions, it's now land belonging to the land of Israel that we acquired legitimately by the defeat of an aggressor. So no, today we're not allowed to enter the land and just go kill people and take their land. But if they start a war with us, whatever we get in the course of that war, and the right to expel all those who fought against us and all those who wish us ill, that now the land is ownerless because they're gone. And that ownerless land belongs to the land of Israel, and since no one owns it, the Jewish people have an obligation to take it. Now, and that's what happened in 48, and that's what happened in 67. Now, let me say that there's another step to this, and that is that it's true that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. And it's true that what they buy legitimately, of course, is theirs, and what an enemy abandons because they started a war and lost it is by absolute right ours of the Torah. Now, and more than that, I would say there's even a right which has not been exercised, that those who fought with you and wish you ill and will still fight with you and still seek to kill you, you have every right to expel them, and therefore the land will be ownerless, and you can take it. Now, even though the ownership of the land of Israel is a fundamental right found in the Torah, provided, again, you don't take the land of an innocent, peaceful person by force, there is a question. It's been argued that if we make a peace treaty in which we give back most of the land of Israel, and certainly Yehuda and Shomron and so on, to the Arabs, then there'll be peace. And if there's peace, people won't die in wars and terrorism, and you'll save lives. And to save lives, you're allowed to break almost any law in the Torah, including the obligation to retain the land of Israel. The problem with that approach is twofold. One is historic, threefold. One is historical, one is practical, and one is practical but halachic. Number one, historically, making concessions to someone because they threaten you with force has never, ever worked out well. You can ask the Poles and the Czechs and all the people who suffered under the Nazis in World War II. You can ask all the people that the Russians have taken over. Frankly, you can ask all the Native American tribes who made concession after concession till they had nothing left. That is the nature of the world. Number two, the second practical aspect is that this is not like the United States and Canada making a deal over the border in Oregon. These are people who clearly hate us, clearly ish us will, clearly want to destroy us, and teach their children that they want the whole land and they want to destroy the Jewish people. They want to exterminate the Jews of the land of Israel. As long as there's any sense that they're your enemy, it makes no sense to make concessions that allow them to have rockets 9 kilometers from Tel Aviv and so on. That is point number two. The third point, which is the halachic practical point, is as follows. As you know, we're not allowed to transgress Shabbat on a life is in danger, then we must. So anytime we're told to transgress Shabbat, it means that you must do it because your life is in danger. So the rule is that if people come and armed forces enter land, and this is land belonging to Jews, and this is true even outside Israel, even in Mesopotamia, and they're just grabbing a few things, then you don't go out to war. But if they threaten your life, in other words, if they will kill you if you don't let them take stuff, and the medieval commentators point out that nowadays any armed person who threatens you is going to kill you if you don't give them what they want. So then to prevent them from harming you, you have to preemptively go out and fight with them on Shabbat. And the commentaries in the Code of Jewish Law say that this is true even if you heard that they're going to come. You have to go out and fight them. And the reason for this is because if you allow them to attack you, you're in a worse position. And then here's the key point about making concessions of land on the borders, which means to say land that would affect the territorial integrity. In other words, where they want to do something at your borders. And if it's a city close to the border, goes on the Talmud and the Code of Jewish Law, even if they only want to steal some straw and hay, you must preemptively go out and fight them to the death on Shabbat, even if they only want straw and hay. Why? Shema tipatecha aretz lifneim, says Rashi, lest the land be opened up before them. In other words, Gemara and Eruvin, in other words, any concession of when you have territorial integrity, you have a country, you have a commonwealth, the Torah rules, and this is Jewish law rules, and this is irrespective of what any military person says, because as we all know, the moment military people become politicians, they no longer are judging from a military point of view. And the point is as follows, that we establish in halakha that any concession to a threat of force, when you have territorial integrity, any concession of even a bale of straw, let alone an inch of land, is endangering the lives of every single person in the country. Jewish law establishes that any concession to a threat of force, especially a territorial one, is encouraging more and is a danger to everyone's in the land. This is an absolute ruling, not subject to dispute. There's no debate about this. And therefore, if someone wishes you ill and threatens you with terrorism or attack and says this war will go on until you make territorial concessions to us, you should know that that territorial concession only brings trouble. And the fact is, every time the Jews have even talked about making concessions, more terrorism follows. In recent 30 years, who knows, what was the worst period of terrorism? The most Jews killed in bus bombings and so on. When? When did this happen? Who knows?
When are you talking about? After the state of Israel?
In the last 30 years.
When after they gave back, give out after Sderot, the other side of
Gaza, that's 2005. Earlier, more than 1,000 Jews died.
1,000 years in an intifada.
The second intifada and the bus bombings after Oslo. After Oslo, after Camp David, after the Y Accords. Every time Israel offered concessions, terrorism broke out. Even talking about giving away an inch of the land of Israel costs Jewish lives. Even talking about it, let alone doing it. And you're right, Sidney. And after they gave up Gaza, how many rockets, how many of our soldiers dead? In the wars we have to keep going in there. But Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, said this 500 years ago, and the Gemara said this 1,500 years ago, and it's based on a story with David, where the men of Kila came to David and said, and asked him what to do, and he says, we have to go out to war. Why? So the Gemara says, because the enemy was taking straw and hay for their horses. Because Kila was near the border, and any compromise of your territorial integrity is a danger to the life of every man, woman, and child in the land. And therefore, the argument that some people have made, even very great rabbis, but who are not aware of the situation, that making territorial concession to the Arabs will bring peace, contradicts a fundamental premise in halacha and history and common sense and human psychology, which halacha takes all those things into account. Therefore, to summarize, it's very clear that the only legitimate claim we have to the land comes from the Torah. And we have to stand up proudly and say, we believe in the Torah, we accept it, we embrace it, and this is our claim, and we don't care what you believe, we stand firm. And deep down, you know the Torah is true because all your religions are based on the Torah. That's number one. And number two, halacha considers any concession or even talk of concession of any of the land that the Jews control is a fundamental danger to the Jewish people. So with that, we have a clear agenda. And therefore, there's no, Jews don't have to go around, whether they live in Israel or not, feeling guilty about our possession. The land is ours, but because the Torah is a Torah of kindness and its ways are peace, we don't walk around taking away land from people who possess it unless they fight with us. And if they start a war, or they want to start a war, or they reject the legitimacy of our claim to the land, or they support acts of terror, acts of violence against our ownership of the land, they lose all their rights to the land. And once they lose their rights, it's ours. You'll say that by giving up land will save lives. Never happened in human history, never will. Because those who are aggressors are aggressors. And those who want to use violence as a means of forcing you to do something, if you give them a finger, they'll take a hand. And this has been true of every conflict in human history. And halacha recognizes this as a reality. So that is, and therefore, because public opinion is important, because we have to make it very clear that the land of Israel is an object of holiness. It is a fundamental, the possession of the land of Israel by the Jewish people is a fundamental part of Judaism, a fundamental obligation of Judaism. That's what we place in Yerushalayim. There are some laws that are based on the premise that every Jew has a portion, owns some land in the land of Israel by right. It's very interesting, but this is the case. And look, don't ask us to give up our religion. Jews have given their lives rather than give up their religion. To ask us to renounce our claim to the land of Israel, to ask us to say that the Arabs or the Japanese or anyone else have a right to the land of Israel, is to ask us to give up our religion, which we won't do. Now, to say that we're obliged to do the ways of pleasantness and peace, and that any non-Jew who owns and lives in the land of Israel should be allowed to retain their land. Again, if they keep the Noahide laws, if they recognize the Jewish claim to the land of Israel, and that it is a Jewish land, if they don't fight against it, and they don't seek to undermine it, we leave them. If any of those rules don't apply, they have no right to live there. And if they have to leave, that land reverts to the Jewish people who it belongs to anyways. And that's what happened in 48. That's probably what should have happened in 67. And that's where we are today. Okay. And I believe these premises are fundamental to are fundamentally demanded by a clear understanding of what the Torah has to say on the subject. The problem is that a lot of Jews, even religious Jews, okay? A lot of Jews, even religious Jews, they understand the Torah applies to them in their personal lives. They don't understand that the Torah also speaks to the people as a whole and speaks of national matters and speaks of matters pertaining to entire bodies of land, such as the land of Israel, and they speak of, and it speaks of social matters and military matters and economic matters. It speaks to the big picture. You know why? Because Jews have been stuck in little communities for so long, we've forgotten that the Torah applies to the nation as a whole. And we've forgotten the Torah applies to questions that affect the nation, that affect the land, that affect military matters, and so on. Now we have an opportunity to apply the Torah to those things. Let's not mess it up. And let's support our brothers and sisters who live in Israel, who are doing that, and loudly and clearly proclaim, without being embarrassed from our non-Jewish friends and neighbors, that this is the case, and that if they believe in our right to live as Jews, they have to believe in our right to possess the land of Israel, because that is more intrinsic to Judaism than Jesus or Muhammad, la'avdil, is to Christians and Muslims. And a lot of us don't realize that this is the case. Any comments?
If no one else speaks up, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, please.
When you say the land belongs to Israel, is
People of Israel.
I'm sorry?
The people of Israel. Israel, I mean Am Yisrael, the way Shimshon Rav Hirsch uses it. The whole
Well,
people
no,
of
the
Israel.
question I have has to do with buying of the land. So if you buy a house, do you buy the land under it, or do you lease the land?
So as far as I know, a lot of the houses in Israel are built on land that's leased. Joe, you know more about this? A lot of the land is leased.
Yeah, but it's not like a 99-year lease. It's basically if you own an apartment in a building, you own the land and you own the apartment and everything else.
Right, but agricultural land is mostly leased still, as far as I understand.
Yeah, the government.
Because my son was looking into how to acquire land in Israel, and it's not so simple.
That's true, but they never took the land. You know, the moshavim and the kibbutzim, they own the land. The government.
Yeah, but
never,
it nominally belongs to the land authority, right?
Yeah, there is some politicking going on with
Right.
this.
Okay, anyways, but my point is that much of what's today they call the West Bank, Yehuda and Shomron, the open land there isn't owned by individual people, whether Jews or Arabs. That open land has always belonged to the ruler, going all the way back to the Romans. So therefore, since there was a war and they lost the war, and in the process of losing the war, we advanced into these areas. Once the Jews possessed the land legitimately, such as by defeating an enemy who started up with you, then the ownership of the land to the Jewish people kicks in, and you're not allowed to give it away to anyone else.
So how about if a non-Jew, not a non-Jew, but one of our former known enemies, let's say, buys land, wants to buy a house there.
If they're
land to build a house.
Are they keeping the Noahide laws and fully acceptance of the right of the Jewish people to the land? Yeah, then yes. Otherwise, no. You're not allowed to allow them to live in the land if they seek your ill or they don't accept the basic rules of human morality.
And is this a practical thing that is in operation?
It would be practical if the land of Israel had a government that applied it. As it stands right now, all kinds of illegal settlements are built by Arabs all the time, and the government doesn't do doodly squat. That's the reality. There's a lot of politics involved. And again, the larger question is ourselves. We need to strengthen ourselves and our own belief in our right to the land.
Reb, what about, this two-state solution that we're going to be confronted with?
The answer is we have to do everything we can to fight against it. We have to fight against, as Americans, we have to fight against our government imposing such a thing on Israel, and Israel has to refuse. Remember, Israel managed for a long time without any American help. Do you know that every attempt to sell modern aircraft to Israel until 1955 was torpedoed by the Truman and then Eisenhower administration? The first country to sell modern aircraft to Israel was France, because Charles de Gaulle wanted to stick a finger in the eyes of America and say, I'm a big guy too, which precipitated the Suez Crisis. But America did nothing for us. I'm an American, but America did nothing for Israel until the late 60s. The whole special relationship only began after the 67 war. And you know what? The much reviled President Nixon was one of the strongest advocates of providing Israel with
I know he did.
modern weapons.
Under a lot of pressure from us, from Goldaleh.
Yeah, okay, but
Most people don't realize.
but you know what? In 48, there was a lot of pressure from everyone, and Truman did everything he could to stop weapons getting to Israel. He arrested Jews.
It's true. But even Nixon and Kissinger, for the longest time, didn't want, right during the 73 war, did not want to supply Israel.
Let me tell you a very sad story. It was more Kissinger than Nixon.
Story.
That's what I just said.
Do you know why? They finally gave in? because we actually had nuclear weapons on our planes. And they told them, you have a choice. And they gave in.
That's part of it. That I don't think we said it, but I, certainly,
No, we
certainly
said
there
it.
was,
We said it.
certainly there was that threat.
And-
But I'll tell you something else that happened. I mean, look, Nixon, to his credit, saw an opportunity to give the Russians a black eye. After Vietnam, he wanted to. But I'll tell you something
Yeah,
interesting.
of course. That too.
But I'll tell you something very interesting. I believe it was Dover Air Force Base my father heard the story at the time, in 73. I believe it was Dover Air Force Base in New Hampshire. There's a big transport command Air Force Base that during the Cold War, they stocked all kinds of missiles and replacement parts and so on in case there'd be a war with the Soviet Union, ready to fly out. So apparently one of the commanders, if not the commander of this base or another base, whichever base it was in Maine or New Hampshire, he basically, loaded up aircraft with missiles and spare parts and so on, and he sent them off to Israel. Then he called his commanding officer and says, look, either you can get clearance to the White House or you can arrest me and court-martial me. And retroactively, the White House decided that they gave the order.
This is, I don't know.
Look, my
That
father heard the
doesn't-
story at the time from
all kind of
from a
stories.
serviceman who was at that base. Now, he was a low-ranking serviceman. He might not have known the whole story. I'm not saying this is terrorist Lukshin. I'm not saying it ever happened, but that's what I heard when I was a little boy at the time.
and who was that guy? What was his name, Rabbi? Who was it?
I don't know. My father mentioned, I think he knew it a long time ago. It may have happened. It may not have happened. Who knows?
No, because in 73, when United States started sending weapons, finally, Phantom jets and missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, they really came with the C-5As from New Hampshire.
Yeah, from Dover, right. So the question is, did he really,
So-
but anyway, no, that's for sure. I will tell you that, before that, America had already sold Phantoms to Israel, which was a big deal. And if you have a few more minutes, I'll tell you an amazing story that who did I hear it from? I heard it from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. In other words, he spoke about this in Yiddish at a Farbrengen that was recorded in 1972 or 73. And here's the story he told. And I've been trying to figure out who the senator was, okay? I haven't been able to find out yet, if anyone can. But here's the story. I'm repeating you verbatim what the Lubavitcher Rebbe said. And he tended to know things. You know that, okay? So here's the story. He says that on the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, there was a senator who was blocking the sale of the Phantoms to Israel. In the early 70s, the F-4 Phantom was the most advanced military aircraft on the planet. As a matter of fact, to this day, it's still in use. The first one flew in 1955. So you can understand how advanced it is that, 60 years later, it's still flying. 70, almost, yeah. Anyways, but at the time, and it came with very advanced electronics and radar, and only countries like the UK and Germany, Japan, close allies of the United States, were sold these aircraft. So as the Lubavitcher Rebbe told the story, this senator was blocking the sale. So what did they do? The pro-Israel group, I guess it must have been AIPAC, took him on a junket to Israel. And the Rebbe goes on to say, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, he says, they took him to all the places. You can hear, I have to find the talk. It's very evocative. And he says, they took him to the Technion, and they took them to see, to see all the new factories, and took him to see all the farms where they made things grow in the desert, all the standard things. And he came and he saw and he smiled and he went back, and his opposition to selling the phantoms to Israel didn't change. So a little while later, they took him on another trip. And here you can hear the Rebbe smiling. And he says, B'chesed u'v'rachamim, which is a Hebrew expression, with God's kindness and mercy, he had a different set of tour guides. And he says, for some reason, they took him to the Kotel, Metala Kaptzon of some Genudget. He took him to the Kotel with all the beggars. You know, if you go to the Kotel, everyone approaches, especially if you look like an American, everyone approaches you for money, right? So they took this poor senator to the Kotel. They brought him to the Kotel, and it wasn't like today with all the security. And all the schnorrers came asking him for money. And then he goes on to say, but them genommen in a yeshiva in Yerushalayim, they took him to a yeshiva in Yerushalayim. In a tunkele keller, mitzubach in the bank, a little yeshiva in a dark cellar with broken benches. They sat and learned in a dark cellar with broken benches. And at Tzaddik Akumen, he came back and he said, and here the Rebbe switched to English, usually spoke in Yiddish. He said, I have seen the land of the Bible and the people of the Bible. And he immediately pushed for the sale of the phantoms. That's the story. In other words, what I get from this story, everyone can get what they want from a story. What I get from this story is that when Jews are proud to be Jews, and when the people who are in charge of showing off Israel show the Kotel and show Jews, who are uncompromising in their Judaism, that is what evokes a sense of awe, a sense of respect, and a sense of a need to help in those who are not Jewish. That our commitment to our beliefs, our commitment to Judaism, in all its aspects, including the possession of the land, is what garners us the most success and the most respect and the most security. That's what I take from this story. If you speak Yiddish, you have to hear this. It's really.
Well, where is it? Can you get it? How can you get a hold of it?
I have to find it. It's sometime in 1972, early 73. I was listening to it in the car. I'll find it. I have to find it. It's quite amazing. But I still haven't figured out who the senator was yet. Anyways. Okay. So I wish everyone a good night, and we have what to do here to make sure that we don't let our fellow Jews and our fellow citizens encourage our government to suggest very bad ideas that are dangerous to the 6.5 million of our brothers and sisters who live in the land of Israel. Not to mention all the non-Jews who live there, who any harm to Israel harms them too. And they know that.
Well,
let me tell you something. Ask the East Jerusalem Arabs who live under Israeli rule. Ask them privately how many of them want to come under the rule of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. The number is slightly less than one.
I know, I heard that. Who complained them, Joe?
They want to complain. No, they're cousins of the Jews. Of course they want to complain.
No, who complained them?
Just a couple of days ago, the final count was published, 9.3 Israeli citizens.
9.3 million, and how many of them are Jewish?
Well, there's 1.2 million Arabs, and there's, there are a few others. So I would say that we have more Jews in Israel than
So
United.
based on that, there's about 600,000 others, like non-Jews living in Israel, 1.2 million Arabs, that's 1.8. So what's 9.3 minus 1.8?
Well, it's 7 and something, 7.5. I don't know.
Well, 9.3 minus 1.8 is 7.5. So there are Bali Ayin Hara, 7.5 million Jews in Israel.
Okay.
That's beautiful.
And growing.
Well, that makes Israel the biggest. One of the good things about Israel is that in Israel, even Jews who wouldn't describe themselves as religious have lots of kids. The average family is, I think, slightly more than 3 children.
There are not too many American Jews know that United States is buying some of the latest equipment from Israel. That
Of
we
course,
don't, technology that we don't have in the United States.
Well, a lot of it is developed in conjunction with American investment, but the Arrow, the mid-range anti-missile missile that America is starting to deploy is an Israeli product. Also, America is buying, I don't know what's the Hebrew name, is the Trophy, the missile protection for tanks that protects the tank against anti-tank missiles. So apparently the Americans are making a big buy of those too.
Good.
Yeah,
Look,
they're buying.
it's well known that every penny that America has, first of all, the aid is spent in America. Second of all, every penny that America's invested in Israel has been paid doublefold. During the Cold War, the Israelis presented the Americans with all the latest Russian equipment to research. And all the American equipment got tested out in Israel. Do you know? You want to know something interesting? 90% of all the premier American air superiority fighters, the F-15. Do you know that 90% of all kills made by F-15s were made by Israeli pilots in the whole world for the last 40 years? You might not know that, and the information that Israel's provided is invaluable. To this day, who do you think provides the Americans with all the information what's going on in Iran?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
As a matter of fact, the joke in Tehran these days is that when the mullahs want to know what's going on in Iran, they send a spy to Israel to find out what the Israelis know about Iran, because they know before they do. At any rate, Hashem should continue to protect our brothers and sisters, and we should do what we can for them.
Amen.
And
And
in Yerbu, may they continue to grow, believe, with Hashem's help.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the basis, and the most important thing we have to do. People have to understand that the land of Israel is a fundamental part of Judaism. It's not something secondary or extra.
Rabbi, forgive me, how far does it go? Where does it go up to? From the sea to...
Well, so that's a big question. If you look at the commentaries in Parshat Masai, the borders are, so for example, the southern part of the Negev is definitely not part of Israel, but the halach is that once the Jews occupy a territory and there's some danger in giving it back, so then it becomes Jewish territory, even if it's not part of the land of Israel. So Eilat stays. But in the north, more than 2/3 of Israel is in the north of the present Israel, if you look at the biblical maps. But Second Temple Israel is pretty much the same as we have today, with the exception of Jordan, which we don't have, and the Negev, which we do. In other words, the land of Israel that is defined as never leaving Jewish possession, which is the Second Temple Israel, and which all the laws of Israel apply to, is pretty close to today's Israel.
Okay.
When Shimon Peres came to speak at Central Connecticut State University, even though he was very, pro-peace treaty, there was a bunch of Arabs protesting outside. they have like all these professional students, they've been students forever, but they come to protest. So I approached one of them and I said, why are you protesting? Shimon Peres is from your best friends. So he says, no, because he also supports the occupation. So I said, really? You object to the occupation? He says, yeah, that's why I'm here. I say, so that's wonderful. I object to the occupation too. He says, really? You a rabbi? I say, yeah. It so happens that the Arabs are occupying Lebanon, which is part of Israel, Western Syria, which is part of Israel, all of Jordan, which is part of Israel, Egypt until the Nile, which is part of Israel. Then he wasn't so happy. I don't know why. But at any rate, have a very good night, everyone.
Rabbi, Labriot, Labriot.
Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you for joining.